big lectures, I actually web augment, and in the labs, I use a full hybrid model with flipped classroom. So for the lecture courses with the web augmentation, which is much easier to do because you have a lot more opportunity to correct any mistake you might make, I was using that already for quizzes and for guided practice. And I decided with the labs to take that a step further and use interactive lessons using Soft Chalk to present the new material. So they would read through their lecture and practice labeling things and do little quiz questions as they went to make sure that they were reading. And that gave us consistency in the lab. Now, the original goal of that was to use that hybrid model to reduce the seat time as well, because before we started the hybrid model, the TAs were lecturing sometimes an hour to an hour and a half in the lab. And what we found was once we implemented the hybrid model, a couple of unexpected things happened. One was that the students became much more active in the lab, and they started spending more time doing their dissections and looking at the specimens and looking at the models and looking in the microscopes. And then we filled the rest of that time by adding more activities, more hands-on reinforcement that we weren't able to use before because we just didn't have the time.
So when I first started doing hybrid or considering hybrid, the first consideration for me was interaction. And so that's why I went with flipped classrooms, because that gave me a really neat model to determine where is it that my students can best leverage the face-to-face versus the online. And so interaction was probably the most critical aspect of it, because it wasn't about lecturing and transferring that onto the face-to-face or keeping it in there. There were higher stakes involved for student-centered instruction. When I determined the flipped classroom, I did look it up, because I know initially my concept of blended learning was just the percentages. It was, okay, I need to have at least this much percentage online, at least this much percentage face-to-face. But I needed something a little more instructive in terms of, well, how do I leverage that time? Not just how do I split it. And so I started looking through it, and then I came across the flipped classroom, and I bought the book that was published, even though it's primarily meant for K-12. There's a lot of transferability to higher ed in there, because they make a lot of logical sense when it comes to curriculum and learning. So I looked up a lot of that, and then once I looked up the initial source, then I expanded my search to look for examples in higher ed in particular. And so I started looking up, every time somebody said, you can do it this way, I looked up a lot of things until I came across something that I thought would work for me, that would divide the kind of thinking that they did online versus the kind of thinking that they did face-to-face. So that's where I initially started with that.
Okay, so first, it was a need to try to help my students actually get deeper into the readings that they were doing and be able to follow up with discussion online. And what I found is that when they had the time off from having to come into class, basically, that they actually did deeper reading and deeper critical thinking about the issue. And so I really started with experimenting with hybrid way back in like 2006 or 2007 when we were still UTB, and we were just starting to experiment with what Blackboard could do. I found that extending the time for reading and extending the time for discussion online for many of my students really helped them to understand what they were reading in a much better way. The other thing that then I realized was that I could extend that in my writing classes when students would be able to do peer review, rather than do the peer review kinds of where they would actually share their papers with each other, instead of having them do it in class one-on-one and just having to share the papers. I found that their comments and their peer review sort of feedback for students was much deeper and much more critical, and they expressed a bit more critical thinking and really giving feedback that was helpful to students if they were able to actually do it online during an online week. And then I think it was in either 2007 or very early 2008, a colleague of mine and I, both of us teaching a 1302 class, wanted to use the same computer classroom, and they were quite limited at the time. And so we sat down and devised and said, well, what if we both use the same classroom, but we do it on different days? And then that became so successful, the students really liked it, so that the week that my students would be in class, hers would be online, and vice versa. And the students, I really found that the students had better writing time. They had more time to really critically think about what they were doing. Peer review was much more helpful and effective. And then when they did come into class, there were the conversations about what they were writing and reading were much deeper. And from that point on, I was hooked. And I said, well, let me find out more about this. And I actually started doing a little bit of research into studies done, and found that study after study had shown that compared to fully face-to-face or fully online, that the idea of mixing the two actually proved to be much more effective than either of those two. So then I started to really experiment what I could do with this and how I could then enhance what I wanted to do. And from that point on, I decided that hybrid was the way to go.
All right. So when the mindset that you should have first and foremost is, what do your students need? I guess it's more about being able to determine where it is that you're going to concentrate your efforts on helping them learn the higher skills. That's kind of the mindset. First and foremost, make sure you think of your students first. And then you start building your hybrid class, because you can't start around your lectures. You can't start about what you originally had. You have to consider that this is a completely new way of teaching. Even though I know it's the easy thing is to just transfer, but it's only easy in the front. When in applicability, when you start teaching it, it becomes very difficult, because you can't transfer what was originally face-to-face to a hybrid class. You need to start from the beginning thinking, okay, some things need to be only online and some things need to be face-to-face, and there needs to be an intentionality to how I divide that.